Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Safina Waters from the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, and I'm really excited to present this topic today. We often talk about climate ambition in terms of targets and timelines, but increasingly, the real currency is data and verifiable data and the carbon intensity of what we produce and trade. And that's where global momentum is shifting. In Europe, with CBAM and Japan, across emerging markets, where new policy frameworks are evolving, and in the private sector, where companies are up-leveling beyond net zero pledges to compete on actual emissions performance. And as we're seeing markets raise the value they place on lower emissions goods, we're seeing the convergence of climate leadership and industrial competitiveness. Companies and countries at the forefront of innovation stand to benefit, but only if we can get the policy right. And getting it right is going to take a lot. We heard today, this morning, Dr. Sultan emphasizing partnership and collaboration. We heard Chris Lehane talking about the mindset to building big. So today's discussion is how we can make that happen and how smarter emissions policies can become a true engine of competitiveness. I am really pleased to be joined by this exceptional panel. We've got Sarah Stewart, CEO of Silverado Policy Accelerator, and Sasha Mackler, Global Head of Strategic Policy for Low Carbon Solutions at ExxonMobil. And we are sending our regards to Dave Banks, who is unfortunately unable to join us today, and we are missing his energy today on stage, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Thank you for joining us today, and let's just dive in. So emissions policies are evolving. Smart standards have the potential to be that competitive advantage in the global markets. But we're also seeing Washington focused on reshoring manufacturing, supply chain, and energy dominance, while at the same time pulling back from international climate pledges. So what practical steps can policymakers take to advance emissions policy in a way that supports the administration's manufacturing and trade agenda? Sarah, I'll ask you first.
Okay, I'm going to conjure up my inner Dave Banks to answer this question. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a big thank you to the Atlantic Council for putting this together. I think this is a really important threshold question. Right? And I think it's probably on the minds of most people who are working at the intersection of emissions policy, trade policy, competitiveness policy, national security, you name it. How do we balance all of these pieces together? So, I mean, I would start from a starting point would be the US market is very open compared to other markets when it comes to tariffs. We're a very large consumption market. And over time, we have seen a real erosion of our manufacturing base as we are bringing in low-priced, higher emissions products from other countries, and we are watching the industries that we had here really be decimated for a variety of different reasons, including as a result of unfair trade practices by other countries. So we have a situation that's emerging now with the president's agenda to bring that manufacturing back on shore, right? At the same time, we've got a very big and I would say an aggressive energy agenda to support that manufacturing and to support things like AI and other things. And that makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense to try and balance both of those objectives and to think about how we can bring all of the policy tools together to bring all aspects of that agenda to the forefront, right? And in my mind, this can include a few different things. Number one, it could include accelerating different types of energy. So maybe it's nuclear. Maybe it's seeing around the corner to the next energy frontier like fusion and seeing what potential supply chain choke points are going to be in our way. It could include protecting the industries that we have and the industries that we want to bring back here from unfair trade, from IP theft, and other illicit practices. And it would also include promoting U.S. exports, not just of energy, but also of the manufacturing products that we're making here. We have a strategic and economic strength. We are a huge energy market. We are going to be a growing manufacturing market. We can use that to our advantage on the global market. So in my mind, it's a three-pronged set of pillars: build, protect, and promote. And that way you can kind of merge all of these different pieces of the administration's agenda together to promote low emissions, but also promote manufacturing at the same time.
And internationally, there's a gap to fill, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sasha, you've articulated a need to move away from project-based incentives to market-forming incentives that drive demand. What types of policies are going to support that?
Yeah, thanks. And it's great to be here, everybody. And I'll just reinforce what Sarah said and send my thanks to the Atlantic Council for the event today, and really pleased to be here. So, maybe to step back a little bit and say a bit about ExxonMobil and, how we're thinking about these issues in general, to build on the thoughts that Sarah shared. The current set of priorities put forward by the administration have really focused on, as you said, onshoring manufacturing and exporting energy. And at ExxonMobil, that's right in our sweet spot, right? We have three global businesses that you're probably familiar with: our upstream business, our product solutions business, and our low carbon solutions business. And when it comes to all three, we have a global view and a global footprint, and we're looking around markets all over the world and trying to figure out the best ways that we can compete and deliver our products into those markets as affordably, as reliably, as safely as possible. And increasingly, as we are working in those markets and dealing with our customers, the additional factor that we're building into our business plan, our business model, is the emissions intensity of our products. And across all of those dimensions, we think we can compete very effectively with all of our global competitors. Now, when we think about this overlay of competitiveness and trade and climate, there's a lot that we can continue to do in today's political environment. Namely, even if we have customers overseas that have a demand for our products, oftentimes we're going to produce it here and send it overseas. And so the carbon footprint or the intensity of those investments, sorry, my mic is acting up a little bit, will factor into the success of what we're doing. But the jobs, the steel that we bend and put in the ground, and the energy that we produce and export can happen oftentimes here. And that's good for the U.S., and it's also good for our customers. But to differentiate those products in the marketplace, we do need a system of accounting and a set of standards that can help us, compete and outcompete, the other sources and options that are out there. And so, to get back to your question, what we've articulated at ExxonMobil is a need to shift or change the framework of climate policy from one in which we have project enabling policies, which is what we have here today in the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act, which in our mind are essential policies to get industries off the ground. But as we're even observing this week here in Washington, they have some durability challenges associated with them, which makes it hard to factor them into our business planning. And thank you. That was getting...
Hold it up here. Don't hold it down there because you're cupping the transmitter.
Okay. All right. Is that better? Sorry, everybody. there's a business model problem with the IRA in the sense that there's a durability challenge, and there's also a scalability challenge because we can't be expecting the public sector to be co-investing in projects over time, even though they're very important partners in the early days to help launch an industry. So our view is that the better way to do this is to create markets for low carbon products. And if those markets exist, we can compete.
Thank you, Sasha. Now, Sarah, when we look at developing these effective policies, it's a little bit like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle that you do over Thanksgiving, maybe with the family. And, you've got different sectors, you've got different products, to Sasha's point, you've got different regulatory frameworks across international, around the world, rather. And, we talk about identifying the potential inequities within those products, but also collaborating internationally to ensure that we can get this off the ground. How do you see that puzzle coming together?
Yeah, it's a great question. Anybody who's done a 1,000-piece puzzle knows that it is very difficult sometimes to figure out the middle until you get the edges, right? And so I would say there's a couple of things that we need to be thinking about here, and you mentioned a few of them. On the one hand, we've got domestic constituencies that drive domestic politics, right? And so that's one piece of the puzzle when we're thinking about a market-driven emissions policy. Who's for it? Why are they for it? Who's going to be against it? What are the roadblocks? We also have to think about, can we do it on our own, right? Because if we are to adopt policies domestically that our partners are not also adopting, we are just creating further inequities for domestic producers. So we need to think about, how are we going to collaborate? But how are we going to collaborate in a global sense when we're not always on the same page with all of our counterparts? Sometimes we are. We have the same shared end goal objectives, but a different path to get there. Other times, we're not even in agreement with our global partners as to what those end objectives are, let alone how to get there. So that's another big piece of sort of the, I would say the border of the puzzle that's really important to get right. We also have to work with the private sector, as Sasha said. They're on the front lines, right? They are the ones that are going to be implementing whatever government policy is out there and having to work that into their business model and deal with their shareholders who are expecting, a sort of inherent self-interested motive.
Yeah, rate of return.
Which is really important. So when you put all of those things together, you have to figure out a path that is going to both be lucrative for the companies, give them a market predictability, an environment where they can make investments here and know that those investments are going to have some durability, right? And that the government policy isn't going to fall out the other side as the winds blow. You also need some predictability in the global market that you're going to have competitive products, whether that means imposing some sort of offsetting measure like a tariff at the border to, compensate for different emissions intensities, or that means making sure that, U.S. exports aren't subject to discriminatory emissions-based policies in other markets. That's a lot that needs to be navigated. So the 1,000-piece puzzle reference, I think, is a really important one because it shows the complexity. Now, here's the good news. While there is complexity in all of this, there is also a path. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we're seeing in the U.S. is we're seeing a path emerging on a market-based emissions policy. There's several bills in Congress. There's, movement in both the previous administration and I think some, relative acknowledgement in this administration that there could be a way forward here that both enables a pro-American manufacturing agenda that enables innovation, but also helps build a low emission, helps continue to build more of a low emissions future, right? And that path is to essentially give credit to US producers for what they are doing already, while offsetting the competitive disadvantage of like products coming into the US market with a much higher emissions profile, which means that they have a lower cost point because they don't have to comply with the same regulations that we have, or they're not investing in new technology that is going to be good for business too. So I think that there's a lot of complexity, but I also think that there is a path forward.
Sasha.
Yeah, that's great. The first thing I would say, to build on what Sarah just laid out, is that American companies are the most efficient in the world, and we can compete, very effectively in all the global markets, and should be rewarded for that efficiency if we're in the context of a carbon conversation. But we currently don't have the full set of sort of frameworks in place from an accounting perspective to really capture those rewards. And so that's something that's missing today. And if it were put in place, it would enhance the competitiveness of American companies, full stop. When we think about the 1,000 puzzle pieces that we were just talking about, the way I look at it is there's thousands of climate policies out there, and it's a very complicated business environment to operate in. Another thing that we should be working towards collectively is a simplification of the climate and carbon regimes. It's layering on regulatory systems on top of regulatory systems is not the way that we're going to find our way to the solution here. And in our view, the establishment of clear, concise carbon accounting that is universally shared by all the actors in the economy, domestically and internationally, and then combining that with intensity standards, which we're already starting to really be focused on because of the CBAM and other policies that are put in place that will depend on carbon accounting. If we have those two things in place, then all of a sudden the climate frameworks that we're dealing with can be simplified, can be pragmatic, and can reveal the natural competitiveness already that we're seeing in U.S. companies, which would be good for the whole domestic agenda here, and I think fits nicely with the political dynamic that we're in here today.
Can I jump in on one thing? Sorry to interrupt, but I think you raise a couple of really important points, Sasha, that I think would be worth underscoring for this group. So, when we talk about carbon accounting, there is not yet a universally recognized carbon accounting system.
That's correct.
We know that, right? There's a lot of movement that's been made by private companies to do that. There's different protocols out there. There's an emerging patchwork of different countries that are looking at sort of border adjustment systems like the EU and Canada and others. But one interesting thing that we did at Silverado this year is we used publicly available information to do an economic model that looked at the relative carbon intensity of the steel and aluminum sector here in the US versus in other countries. Was it perfect? No, but it was based on publicly available information, and when compared to a similar study done by the US government that did collect, more proprietary information, the results were not far off, right? And that model looked at the emissions associated with steel and aluminum from the most upstream point all the way to the factory gate, right? So this is not just possible. I think it's very much on the horizon that this is something that could be done to support these policies. Now, the other piece of it is, okay, so we could do it here. But again, we've got the issue of what are our trading partners doing? And how are they looking at carbon accounting? Are they looking at it in the same way as we are? Because if they're not, it's going to make for a regulatory nightmare and a trading headache, and nobody's going to want to pursue these policies. But here's also optimism there. We can have interoperable systems of carbon accounting. It is 100% possible. We've looked at it. I encourage anybody who's interested to follow up. We've got a lot of this written on our website. But you can create an interoperable global system that uses verifiable data to measure these emissions so that you don't end up in a sort of catastrophe for businesses, but rather in a system that works for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It would be an enormous unlock for business to have such a system in place that was technically grounded, scientifically principled, that didn't have a bias for one technology over another. What we would find, I think, quite quickly in a world that had a framework like that is that there's an enormous amount of emissions reductions that could take place quickly and cost effectively, and that in our view the American manufacturing base, the American energy industry would fare very well in such a system, and you could use it to design policies globally that could be a real simplification versus what we are facing today in the business environment, and much more effective. So that's really the rationale for what we're talking about here. And such accounting frameworks do not currently exist. I completely agree with that. We don't have a system in place today. But the ideas and the opportunity to create it are here. And so it's really now is the time to do this. And if we do it, it'll be an enormous unlock for U.S. business.
And how are businesses leading the way, would you say, in the U.S. today?
Well, there's a lot of thinking going on right now, not just in the business community. I mean, certainly within the business community, but also, in places like Sarah's organization. There's an organization you may not know much about, but I predict you will shortly, called the E-Liabilities or E-Ledger Institute, and Karthik Ramana is here, and he's been doing some very important thinking on these issues. Former Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz and his group, the Energy Futures Initiative, just put out a paper today on this topic of carbon accounting. So there's a lot of really important thinking happening now that I think will build towards some action. And on behalf of ExxonMobil, I'll say we're speaking with a lot of our peer companies, not just in the oil and gas industry, but across industry, on how we can start to build a more collective voice to bring these ideas forward, because we do feel like there's an opportunity here. There's some white space, and there's a really strong rationale for moving ahead in this direction to really foster investment in new energy products, because, as I think you're all aware, we're a company that's been around for more than a century. We plan to be around for a lot longer. We've managed through time to stay on top of the industry because we're looking ahead and we're providing those products that our customers want. And that's really what's behind our low carbon solutions business. We see the world is moving in this direction, and we're willing to put the capital into it to provide these products, but it does require frameworks in place that recognize what we're doing and what others in this space are doing, and that's what we're talking about here.
Thanks, Sasha. Sarah, I'm going to ask you, how do you see CBAM and similar moves abroad influencing the U.S., and what kind of coordination is there potential for?
I think it's, for most people, I'm guessing, in the audience know what the CBAM is, but it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism that was adopted by the European Union, and there's a number of other countries that are looking at similar types of mechanisms, with the idea being that you want to sort of have a level playing field for your domestic producers as well as for importers. Now, in the EU, they have a different system than we have here because they have an emissions trading scheme domestically. So, their motivations were slightly different. I would say I don't love the structure of the EU CBAM, and there's things about it that will create, I think, discriminatory end result. And I think it's not really interoperable because it's trying to look at how to create analogs among only countries that also have domestic carbon price. And I don't think that that is the right way to approach it.
Doesn't connect everyone.
Right, it doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply in the US and probably won't for the foreseeable future. And so I think a different system is necessary. One, again, that is interoperable but not identical, right? And I think that we have the moves that the U.S. has made on legislation or proposed legislation, and potentially, I think through executive action, could lay that groundwork. Now, we've lost the first mover advantage, which is not great, but before the other types of systems, like what the EU has in place, proliferate even further, there is an opportunity for the U.S. to really act in this space. But it's difficult. Yeah. Our politics, are such that we have not been fast to move on some of these issues. But I really believe that we've got an opportunity. If we don't act soon to try and, course correct from systems that we don't love, like the EU CBAM, and start to help to steer the rules of the road, we are going to find ourselves left behind having to comply with what other countries are coming up with versus putting ourselves first. And so I think that we need to really kind of accelerate the thinking that we've been already doing and think about what are the policies that can come out of the executive branch on this, and what are the legislative priorities that can be advanced in short order. And I'll just finish by saying one of the reasons that this is so important is because having a policy like a border pollution measure will not only help with U.S. manufacturing, it's going to create a durable environment. It's going to accelerate U.S. investments, but it's also a matter of national security. And I think that this is a point that gets lost a lot of times. It is a matter of national security to ensure that we have robust U.S. producers that are competing on a level playing field. When they have to compete against countries that don't have the same norms, values, standards, whatever you want to say, that is a competitive disadvantage in sectors that are highly energy intensive, that are very important to our national security and our economic security. So if you can't get behind it from an emissions perspective, get behind it from the fact that this is a national and economic security imperative.
Yeah, I think, you've highlighted another theme, which is urgency. We've heard that a lot this morning as well. So I'm going to start to wrap it up here, unless, Sasha, you have any other comments.
No, go for it.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing urgency, and, technology, as we were discussing earlier, is agnostic. So hopefully, in that sense, helps to usher in the change needed in a faster, more efficient way. And also simplification and reaping rewards rather than penalization, I think, is coming through loud and clear. So with that, I think we're going to close, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this fabulous panel. Lots of great insights here today. So thank you very, very much, Sasha and Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.